Welcome to video 1 in the balking and reneging module. This is the introduction and details video where we will give a brief overview of the two topics, and then we'll talk a little more detail about the balking and reneging topics, and then we will talk about state assignments and statistics that are provided through the objects of the standard library. So what exactly are balking and reneging? Well, they're two related concepts. Balking is when an entity arrives but decides not to enter the intended destination. So you go to a fast food restaurant, open the door, see a line, and you leave because the line's too long. That's called balking. Reneging is related, but reneging is after you've already entered the destination, so you've already gotten into the queue, and then you decide to leave. So you get in the queue and you decide, you've waited too long and you're going to leave. That would be reneging. We're discussing these two topics together in this video because they have very similar concepts and behaviors. And these two behaviors or these two concepts are very common in service-oriented applications like banking, call centers, as I mentioned, fast food, and other service-type industries. Another related topic that we'll talk a little bit about is called jockeying. And this is where an entity leaves one queue, so it reneges, but joins another queue in the same system. So this notion of switching lines and stuff like that. Okay, so what exactly is balking? As I said, it's when an entity arrives and decides not to enter the intended destination. And this could be for several reasons. First of all, there could be no space available. The system or the queue could be totally full. The queue could have reached its limit on the number in the queue. So the example I gave before where the line's long enough where you choose not to wait. So there might be room, but you've just made a choice because of the queue length. And finally, the entity could just choose not to wait for a reason that doesn't have anything to do with the queue. It could be a probabilistic decision, it could be the occurrence of some other event, whatever. The basic idea, again, is that an entity arrives and for whatever reasons decides not to enter the intended destination. So with respect to balking, there are two key elements. First is, under what conditions does the balking occur? So when an entity arrives, okay, what happens? What are the conditions that leads balking to happen? And secondly, well, what happens to the balking entity? So you decide not to enter a bank because the line's too long. Well, what do? Do you continue down the street? Do you go to another bank? Do you go have lunch? What do you do? And so these two key elements need to be considered when you look at balking. In Simio, the balking, if we look at Simio here and pull out a server element, the balking and reneging both are set by the buffer logic properties. And we will go over those in a little bit more detail after we talk about reneging. So back to PowerPoint. Let's see here. There we go. So what is reneging? As I mentioned, after an entity has already waited in a queue, so you've already gotten in line, or you've entered a station, the entity decides to abort the process and leave. And so this can happen again for a number of reasons. First of all, you might have a waiting time tolerance. I'm willing to wait in line 5 minutes, no more. Or I'm willing to wait in line somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes. A triggering event might occur, so you might see something, something else that's going on. Your phone might ring, something else that triggers you to decide to renege. An entity just chooses to move elsewhere. And as I mentioned before, jockeying is one specific example of this, choosing to move elsewhere. So this is when you switch lines. So when you choose a different queue in the same system. So you're standing in line at the grocery store, the line next to you becomes shorter, you leave the line you're in and enter the other line. You've just done jockeying. So as with balking, there are also two key elements, in fact the same two elements that define the reneging. First of all, under what conditions does reneging occur? And secondly, what happens to the reneging entity? So now back to the details of where we essentially answer these two questions. And there are two places, one in the standard library, which I showed earlier, we have the buffer logic. I'm going to go back to that in just a second. And secondly, within the station element, if you're using a station with processes, we can also specify the balking and reneging logic with respect to that station. So let's go into Simio and look back at our server that we placed earlier. And let me just make that a little bit bigger. Here we are, there's our server, and here is the buffer logic properties section. And so you can see we have the buffer logic for the input buffer and the output buffer. We have capacity, and if it's set to infinity, then there's no notion of balking because you have infinite capacity. We also have options here where we can specify the reneging triggers. And so the reneging triggers, let's go over that first. It's a repeat group because there are multiple instances where I might want to renege. So I might renege if I've waited in line longer than 5 minutes or if the line next to me becomes shorter. So that would be two separate conditions. One is time-based and one is event-based. And so with the repeat group, I can add as many different triggers as I want. And as I mentioned, we have time-based triggers, we have event-based triggers. And then we can specify the details of the trigger. So we want to have, if we have a time-based one, we have a wait duration, then we can have a reneging decision type. Is it probabilistic? Is it conditional? Do I always renege? And then finally we specify where we go. So what's the node name that we want the entity to be transferred to? Note that the default here is to destroy the entity. So if I set a time-based renege trigger and say I want to wait 2 minutes, and I always renege, then at the end of 2 minutes, if the entity is still on the line, the entity will be removed from the queue and will be destroyed. Alternatively, as I said, I could set a node destination and say, okay, I want this entity to be sent to a particular place. Maybe I want to send it to a different sink so that I can compute statistics, whatever. So that can be specified. Okay, so back to balking. When I look at the balking options, I basically have a balk type decision initially, which is set to none, which means we wouldn't balk at all. So if the input buffer is full, if we set a capacity and it's full, then the entity would not be allowed to enter the object. Alternatively, I could have 3 different types of balking condition. One is if the node is blocked, or if the buffer is full. So if I set a buffer capacity and the buffer is full, then we want the entity to balk. And under that condition, we would say, okay, well, where do you want it to go? And as with the reneging, we basically have 2 choices. If you don't specify anything, then the entity is just destroyed. Otherwise, I can specify a node to transfer that entity to. We can also have conditional and probabilistic balking. So this again has nothing to do with the capacity of the buffer. If I have a condition, then the entity would arrive, the condition would be tested, and then if the condition is true, the entity would balk, and it would either be destroyed or sent to a different node location. If we have probabilistic, it behaves basically the same way, except the condition is a simple probability versus a more complex condition expression. Note also, since the combiner and separator objects are both based on the server object, then they also support this same buffer logic and the same reneging and balking behavior. So secondly, we said that we could specify the balking and reneging for a station. So if I jump over into the definitions elements and let's just create a station, we can see here under the advanced options that we have the balking and reneging. So we have the same reneging triggers, and then we have the balking decision type and the redirection type of where I want that to go. So in addition, we can also do state assignments based on the balking and reneging. So within the properties, so the state assignment section of the properties, in this case the image is from a server, but again we would see the same thing for combiner and separator. We have 2 categories here, one on balking and a second one on reneging. And so on balking would make the specified state assignment in the case where an entity balked. And so you can make entity state assignments, you could make model state assignments, whatever type of state assignment you want to make on the condition or when an actual balking event occurs. And so one example that I might want is if an entity balks, I want to reset its priority so that it can move in a different direction, or it can be prioritized above other entities at subsequent stations or something like that. And we have the same thing on reneging. When an entity reneges, then we can make that, we have that same set of assignments. So in the example I had before, if you're implementing a jockeying behavior, an entity reneges, I might want to set its higher priority so that when it goes in the next queue, it has a higher priority. And finally, there are some statistics available, and so I'm not going to show this in Simio in this video, but we'll see it in the workshop, which is in the next video. And so there are 2 functions. The object name buffer name number box. So for example, if we have an object named server1 and we're interested in the number that balked at the input buffer, we have the function that provides that data, and same for number of reneged. And if you look in the pivot grid example that we see here, here's my server1 object, here's my input buffer, and there's my number balked and number reneged for the input buffer. And we would have that same thing for input buffer and output buffer for all of the object instances that we have in our model. We can also use these functions if we want for experiment responses, if we're interested in that information to do during our experimentation. And so that concludes this video, and as I mentioned, in the next video we will be doing a workshop that involves both balking and reneging.